Hey everybody, this is Baileywiki, and I've got quite a few friends with me today. You're looking at a 3D scene, and what we thought at this point with all this 3D content is we want to show you how to do 3D combat in Foundry. So we're actually going to run a session here, and to help me do that, we've got a couple of special guests. First of all, we've got Zephyr with me. Hey, Zephyr.
Hello. Hello.
And we also have Swift from the team. As you guys may have heard, he is our 3D art director and is responsible for a lot of the stuff that you see here in front of you now. Hey, Swift.
Hi, guys.
And last but not least, we've got the architect of our fate here, the developer of 3D Canvas, Ripper, with us. Hey, Ripper, how you doing?
Hey, yo, I'm doing good.
Great. So this is really the team we need to get together to be able to show you guys how to approach combat. Now, we've been learning this ourselves. In fact, we just did a one-shot. You guys will see this aired probably in a few days with Atropos and quite a few other names from the Foundry community. And we did do a 3D scene there with some really cutting-edge technology. We thought, you know what? We already learned stuff just from doing that one-shot. Let's jump in here and show you guys how to approach combat, because there's new stuff. There's animations now that you can do with 3D Canvas that is brand new. So we're going to show you guys some of those pieces. So I think the way we want to approach this today is we're going to start by probably showing you guys what modules we're using today, just to help clarify what you need to come set up with. And then we're going to talk about, to start, just the approach for how you want to set up a scene that you're going to be doing combat in. So with that, let's open up Swift, because we're looking at Swift screen right here. Let's open up your module manager and just kind of show some modules that we're running here.
Certainly can.
So if you type in 3D, that'll quickly filter down to some of our key 3D ones. So we got 3D Canvas, we've got the map making pack, the 3D Canvas token collection, which we've used some tokens in here. And then we also are using 3D portraits, which lets us use things like Hero Forge. We've got the Baileywiki 3D compendium here, which a lot of these assets are sitting in. And then we also have the special, which you guys may not see it, but this file picker plus 3D thumbnails module that lets you look at 3D thumbnails within your file.
Oh, actually, I do want to make a note on that. The file picker plus 3D thumbnails was a fan-made module in the V9 era. You do not need that anymore. That's now integrated in the file picker and the 3D portraits combo.
Learning something already. Now, we also have some automation things set up. We have MIDI qual. So if you guys don't know, MIDI qual does work with 3D Canvas and even works with volumetric templates. So, sphere in the air is smart enough to detect and like auto target, things like that. So MIDI qual, and then we've got that paired with automated animations as well. That's from Otagon, I believe. And automated animations we all know from the 2D world, but it's actually working in 3D, fair enough to say, right, Ripper?
Yeah. Since V9, like the last days of V9, the particles effect have been added to automated animations. We had some new stuff now, like beside the particles, but those have been in for a bit.
So with that, any other modules that you guys want me to touch on that I missed?
Well, we are using volumetric templates, right? And we probably are not covering it in this video, but there is a new integration between Level's automatic cover calculator and MIDI. So it will automatically do the cover calculation in the background while you do your attacks, and that one also works in 3D, but there is no setup necessary. You kind of just enable it.
Okay, great.
And it works in the background.
All right. Okay, so with that, let's talk about how we want to approach building a scene in general, and then we'll talk about like special effects. So let's get into things like models and meshes and stuff like that. Ripper, what do we want to be thinking about as we're designing a scene?
Well, when we design the scene, the first thing we want to keep in mind is that we don't want to overload 3D Canvas with a lot of models, meshes, and all that stuff. Because yes, 3D Canvas is very flexible. That doesn't mean, though, that you can, put like a mega scan in and it will work fine. Of course, there are going to be some kind of issues. We're not going to go super technical in the details, but let's imagine a 3D model like a container. And a 3D model can contain many other 3D models. So if we take, for example, a mini, these HeroForge minis or the ones in the compendium are very optimized. But maybe if you download something from the internet, you have like a mini that is like all split into parts. So the arms are a model, the torso is another model, the head is another model. And you don't really have a way to know when you download it. But as you accumulate these modules, these minis made of many different parts, the performance starts to suffer. And this is the same for buildings and anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I had a torch that was just like tons of meshes, and it was crazy. And it was a tiny little model, right? And I didn't really truly appreciate how much it was impacting my scene. I probably had like 6 of them around the scene. And I just got that, off the internet, right? There's lots of models on the internet. There's a lot of Creative Commons stuff that you can use. And that's the danger of using those, is you can get them into your world and you can find out that even a tiny little model is impacting your performance. Now, we optimize all of our models in the Baileywiki compendiums. Ripper, I think you do as well. So if anyone's working out of your stuff or out of our stuff, I think they're fairly safe. But but for anyone who's just like pulling off the internet, just keep that in mind. You can always test it.
Yes, always double check.
Yeah, exactly.
And as of recently, 3D Canvas has a built-in tool that lets you check this stuff. So Swift, if you can open the configuration for a tile on the scene, we can see
this wall here by double right-clicking.
Yeah. If you go into the 3D tab, you can see that like the first line tells you how good or bad this model is. So there is an immediate visual impact with the color. So green, good; yellow, be careful, don't use too many; red, bad. And you can see this is one of your models, and it's a single mesh, so it doesn't create performance issues. The most important number that you want to look into this little text outside of the red, green, yellow color is the meshes. That is going to be the one that's going to impact performance the most if you have too many.
Yeah, that's right. And that torch I mentioned had like over 1,000 meshes just in a tiny torch. So don't assume what you have. Take a look at these metrics, and it will give you a better idea. Okay,
Exactly.
so that's models. What else should we be thinking about as we're just doing basic design?
Well, with the basic design, sometimes we want multiple pieces of the same thing. So we can see in this scene, for example, we have the grass. That is a great example. We have like some grass patches. And we can see that we have a ton of grass models, but our scene is not getting tanked completely. And there is a reason, because we're using the repeat mode. This is another thing included in 3D Canvas. If we open the configuration and we go to the 3D tab, we can see that this model has 2 meshes. And you might be asking, well, I see a lot of grass here. How is this 2 meshes? Because every single piece of grass is just 2 meshes. You can see that you can kind of see it from the outline that every piece of grass is basically 2 flat planes put in like in a cross shape. And it's getting instanced. So we can see on the top, we can see instances. We have 280. That means we have 280 copies of this grass. Now, if you try to load a PBR material into this, it's gonna, there we go, it's gonna show with a different texture. And we can see that it's just the same thing repeated over and over with some variation.
Right.
And even though it's 280 copies of this thing, the point is that they are copies. They're not separated from each other, right? And the magic of this is that the GPU is doing all the work. We don't need the CPU to send all the geometry information, the material, every frame to the GPU. We are just telling the GPU, yes, take this model, like make me 280, and the GPU can do a lot of them very easily.
Right. Now, GPU is an important statement. We'll make that in a second when we get into like performance settings and stuff like that. But your players may not have GPUs, right? They may have old graphics cards and things like that. And so we're going to talk about, obviously anything in these scenes is going to start adding to the load. So we want to show you guys, what adds to the load and what to do for players with lower integrated cards, things like that.
Exactly. Stuff like this tiles that are repeated. We've seen the grass that is repeated with the repeat property in 3D Canvas. If you set it to repeat, you can then like set some properties to tell it like how many to make, are generally pretty cheap on performance, unless you scale them up to very high amounts, or the models that you are repeating are very complex. Because we're using this simple billboard that is one of the dynamic meshes included in 3D Canvas that you can like generate in the software. You don't need a 3D model for it. Those are very optimized, very cheap, and you can like make a lot without tanking performance. Having a lot of meshes, complicated geometry, and stuff like that, it's gonna tank the lower end hardware. But that's not gonna be the thing that tanks it the most. Usually, the stuff that tends to destroy integrated cards is more on the special effects side of things.
All right, so what's available to us from an effects perspective that would affect the map itself, right? So sort of, I would call it like environmental effects.
So one of the effects that we have is the particle effects that are kind of flagged as weather, let's call them. And we can find them in the scene settings. Under the 3D Canvas tab, in the bottom, we have the particles, and we can set up some effects that will affect the whole scene. This particle effect system does not use like external libraries or something. I wrote this myself, and it's extremely optimized for quantity. So it's less customizable, but it's very optimized for making a lot of particles, basically.
Okay. Swift, you want to tick on snow and see how the effects are seen?
There we go. And we can enable our snow. And this will affect performance very marginally. Even on lower end hardware, effects like this will be pretty much fine. And I don't know if we can show it in the recording, but if we open the console with F12, we can see actual reports on the weather. So you can see that we have initializing weather system. It tells us like how many particles we are we're currently seeing. So if we change, for example, the effect to something like the heavy rain, you will see that the particle count will be considerably heavier. We're now at 177,000 particles.
And it really
and
is
as you can see,
performant.
Yeah, it's very performance for the quantity.
Yeah, I'm watching the FPS counter at the bottom of Swift's screen and also at the bottom of my screen as I'm logged in here, and it's barely changing, adding the particles.
Yeah, the environmental effects are very performant. They are made precisely for this reason. There is a warning that I must give. There are a couple of effects that will be heavier. So if you go into the scene, we can tank the FPS very quickly here. If you drop down, we have the ones I call volumetric, which is dust, smoke, and toxic fumes. These three effects are heavier. So if you don't have a decent graphics card, they are gonna be pretty bad on performance. We can see that like even on Swift's hardware, which is like a relatively old-ish basic tier graphics card, everything is still fine. But that will depend on the size of the scene and whatever you have. If you have integrated graphics, using like this volumetrics will not be a great idea for your players.
Yeah, and we had Fog, for example, enabled the other night and felt like there was some performance from it as well. So great to know.
Yeah.
I have a quick question about that, actually. Regarding
Yes.
the particles, do you get the same level of performance using the custom particle presets? Like, for example, I set up a snowfall earlier today.
That is correct. Yes. The custom still uses the same performant particle system that can handle a lot of particles. You can see that right now we have like what? That's even more than the rain.
355,000. Yeah.
Yeah.
Twice as much. I did set the density quite high.
Yeah, and you can see that the performance is still fine. You can even try to up the density. It will probably, I believe it caps us at 500,000, I think. But we will find out very soon. Yeah, so that is the cap. It will not go over that because you can also stack multiple effects as well.
That's very true, yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's particle effects. What about other kinds of effects? We've got things like, just local particles, right? So like fires flickering. You've got trees that are waving in the wind using shaders there. You can have water that's moving. Tell us about some of that.
So speaking of still staying in the particle effects kind of scene, we have another particle effect system, which is the one that drives the spell animations, the light particles, and all that kind of stuff. So we can create a light in the scene to show them. These particle effects are, feel free to create a light. These particle effects are driven by a library. It's called Nebula that does these particle effects with physics-based performance and stuff like that.
I
think someone.
My tab seems to have frozen. Hold on.
I think someone made a light. Yeah, there we go.
I think I accidentally made a light. Not really.
Yeah. I will also explain why it froze, but before that, so it's driven by this other particle system, which is pretty heavier on performance, but it has all these physics simulations. So this one is more optimized for customization and quality than the weather effect, which is more quantity-based, but you cannot tell it, yes, do it only in this area or stuff like that. So the lights hold particle effects that you can set up. So if we double right-click our light, we can check them very quickly. We can go into the 3D tab, and we have the particle effect, which we can enable and apply, and there we go. So this can be customized. We are not going to go deep into customization, but you can see all the settings that you can set right under the effect. You can even enable the particle effect when the light is disabled. So if you don't want the light, but you just want to use it as a particle emitter, you can enable that, disable the light. But yes, you can. Yeah.
I was going to say one thing that is important is that how big the cloud of particles is depends on the radius of the light. So if I set these to 5, they all get clumped right into the middle. So if you want to make a little brazier that's on fire and you want to use particles, maybe you want to set the radius way, way, way down. Or if you want to make a cloud of fairy fire, then you might want to set it much, much, much higher. But, sorry, carry on.
Exactly. And speaking of lights, we also have the light animations that are working. That's a relatively recent thing in 3D Canvas. But we have some of the animations working. So the torch and the pulse and the chroma are currently working on the light. And you can set it as the animations in 2D. Yeah, so it's the same thing. But if you set a pulse, it should start pulsing. There we go.
Move it down to closer to the ground so you can see it a bit easier.
Yeah. So these are our particle effects, and this system that we're using on the lights is the same system that drives what we can call spell effects. We can see a couple with a macro maybe. We will dive into automated animations integration later on, but it's the same underlying system. And these are more meant to be temporary particles. So do not overdo it with fixed particle emitters. Do not make a weather effect that works with some light placed very high and set the gravity and stuff like that, because it's gonna affect performance. So don't go overboard with this kind of particle effects. The reason we got a little freeze before we get off from the light train is whenever we add a light, WebGL needs to re-render all the shaders that kind of render the scene. So it's going to freeze for a second to create that light. If we create subsequent lights in rapid succession, it's going to still happen. But if you delete and recreate or move a light, it's not going to happen. Unfortunately, it's a WebGL limitation. I cannot do much about it.
Yeah. And I would suggest that if you do have a lot of effects or even any effects for a particular scene and you have it to really kind of set the mood, when you get into combat, turning those things off can be something that you want to do, right? When you just want to kind of optimize for the next, you're going to be playing for the next 2 hours on this map. You can also, just realize you can just right-click those lights and turn them off. You can build Monk's Active Tile, automation around that, things like that. But just keep that in mind too.
Yeah, simply turning the light off will turn off the particles. So you're also good on that front.
Great.
So in terms of lights, lights are not that bad on performance, actually, surprisingly. It's only annoying when you create them that does that like little freeze. But if you have like 1,000 lights, it's not gonna destroy performance. I mean, maybe don't have 1,000, but if you have a lot of lights, it's not gonna be actually particularly relevant to performance. Continuing with the special effects, I think we briefly touch on to the token special effects. These are like little animations that are baked into 3D Canvas, and they are very cheap to use. So feel free to spam them as much as you want. You can right-click a token. If you right-click a token, you can open the HUD. Just one right-click. Yeah. And if we go on to the magic wand, we will see that we have some options. So the stuff on the top is like graphical effects. If we go on the bottom, we have the animation. So the last 3 rows, if you click them, they will play a little animation. And these are very simple. They're very cheap. You can use them even if your players have a very bad hardware to like add a bit of fun. Players can also play animations on their tokens. So you can tell them and they can click stuff,
Yeah, and these are great just to show really quickly that you're attacking, sort of thing.
Yeah, you can kind of emote with them, I would think.
Yeah.
The last part of the special effects would be the shaders, which are probably the beefiest part of special effects. So as Swift is showing us, we can access this configure shaders menu. This menu is present on tiles, is present on tokens, is present on templates. I do not remember if it's on walls as well. It might be, but I don't know. I don't think anyone is going to use it on walls. But and this menu has a lot of effects that you can run on tokens, tiles to customize things. You will see that I've baked in a warning in some of the effects. So, for example, this idle one is pretty much free to use. But others, such as like fire, lightning, ice, have a warning. If you click on their tab, they have that little thing. And if you hover, it's going to tell you, yes, if you use too much of this, you're going to tank performance. So that's a nice indicator. We can see some of them in action. This will create dynamically generated effects. So these are not like textures. This is like math generated effects, basically, that are calculated directly on the GPU. So if you use them on many objects or on big surfaces, it's gonna slowly eat away your performance, especially if you don't have an integrated, dedicated GPU. So for integrated GPU, using this kind of effects is gonna be pretty heavy. Or if you apply it to the whole map, it's gonna be pretty heavy. But you can play around with them, enable them, disable them. There are many variations to show like common status effect and stuff like that. For the tokens, the ones that are more interesting is the third line, so fire, ice, lightning, oil, and we have the idle shader that, as we can see, gives a bit of like passive movement to the token, like it's kind of breathing. So yeah, we can exaggerate the intensity to actually like see kind of what it's doing. But these are very cheap because any shader that acts on the geometry of the model tends to be cheap. Anything that like acts on like the color, the texture, stuff like that tends to be more expensive.
Okay, great. Good to know. What about things like swaying trees and water that's flowing? What are those?
Yeah.
Things? Is that changing the geometry so relatively cheap?
Exactly. So the water and the geometry tend to be extremely cheap. You can use those to create this effects that like look honestly very good and add like some movement to the scene, and they are basically free of charge because like they are just like moving a couple of vertices around. It's not doing anything crazy. And the same thing we can do for water, which is very easy to create by using the shaders. You can create pretty convincing oceans and water puddles and stuff like that. We can show one if we can. Swift, if you just use the built-in tool to make a box in the tile layer. We can just make a box. We can use the scroll wheel to make it taller, and we can just slap the ocean shader on it. And either we make it blue, or we give it like a texture, but we don't really need it. And as you can see, with like a couple of clicks and a bit of compiling of shaders, we already have some water. As you can see, the dynamic mesh is created with a pretty simple geometry. That's why you see the jagged edges. But if we open the advanced settings, we can increase the dynamic mesh resolution to like 2, 3 or something to have a smoother ocean. There we go. Now it's pretty smooth. And then if we add a texture, it's gonna better, etc., etc. But
is there a water texture in here? No.
I don't think so. You can probably either find like a forgotten mesh run or use there was like a blue texture that was like some kind of plastic or something. But yeah, there we go.
This is still
just as an example.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Or we can create these pretty convincing water simulations. There is like a lot of sliders in this one. 90% of the times you can just use a speed and scale and you get like what you want. The rest of the stuff is kind of there if you really want to, be an ocean nerd.
Great. Okay, good.
Pretty much.
So speaking of vision, 3D Canvas has many options. It's very granular in terms of how you can set up vision to be more or less expensive, more or less cool. By default, the vision in 3D Canvas is going to be set as your players can see the whole map, but vision is still going to be blocked by objects. So they're like not going to see the token, but they're going to still see the map. So I don't know if the default settings have been changed for this specific map. If we have a token, there we go. We have a token with vision, so we can see that it can see like through the doors, it can see the token inside. And if it goes back enough, it can see the token on top of this little thing. And if it goes into the plaza or the brick location or whatever we want to call that, they can see all of them. So the whole map is visible. Remember that. That's like the default. But you can still block token vision. That's how I personally like to play combat and stuff like that in my maps when I use 3D, because I like my players to like see all the map. I generally don't have that like many secret areas in like combat encounters. And this is it's pretty much like cheap on performance. It's not like a big issue. We can head into the scene settings and see how we can like tweak these to make it like basically kind of worse. Because from here we kind of go down. So we can see that we have one vision setting enabled, which is use 3D geometry for site calculation. This is off by default, but it's suggested to basically be enabled if you're working with a 3D scene. What this is going to do is you're not going to need to place walls, but it's going to be the 3D models that you place on the map that are going to block sight and stuff like that.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So it's very convenient.
I haven't set up any 2D walls for this scene at all. It is just the geometry.
Yeah, and it's very convenient because it lets you make maps super, super fast. Of course, you could technically wall the map completely in 2D, eyeballing the height of walls, setting the walls to not be visible in 3D, and use that, and it's going to be very performant, but it's kind of a pain in the ass. So instead, we are lazy and we use the 3D geometry, which is more expensive. But it's going to be fine if Fog of War is not enabled, basically. When you start enabling Fog of War, that's when it's going to start to be more expensive. So if we enable Fog of War, there's a nice performance-heavy warning. We can save changes. It's going to reload our scene. And now we can see that we have the Fog of War. Of course, this map, I'm assuming, has been explored. But,
yes.
If it wasn't, it would be black and we would normally explore it.
I can reset the Fog of War.
Yeah.
And then
let's reset.
Randall here.
There we go. So we can see that if we move Randall, it's going to explore the Fog of War as normal. But we might have a bit more slowdowns depending on our hardware. You can see that the Fog of War doesn't continually refresh. It has like some... there is like a little of a timeout between the refreshes, so it doesn't completely obliterate its performance. So that's the kind of trick I've been using to make this more usable. But we can see that the 3D geometry is blocking vision. And we can disable side blocking per object. So if you intend to use Fog of War, make sure that you don't have vision blocking enabled on things that are kind of useless. For example, an easy thing to forget is to disable vision blocking on grass. We don't really need grass to block vision, you know? So those are kind of tricks that we can use if we are using Fog of War.
For those of you who haven't built yet, like I talk about a module from ADIV called Mass Edit, and you can go to your tile layer, hit Control A, and literally select all tiles. Remember, these models are all just tiles. You can select all the tiles, and you can turn off block vision for all of them all at once, and then just selectively turn it on if you think you need it. I do that when I'm designing things just to make sure that they're optimized, but. Again, that's Mass Edit. It helps you just make things, large changes really quickly.
Yeah, that's perfect. And this scene has like quite, I want to say a decent amount of tiles, a decent amount of 3D models. And we can see that even on like Swift hardware, which has a very basic, oldish graphics card, but it's dedicated, not integrated. The Fog of War is running in a, like it's more than playable. We still have between 50 and 30 FPS, even while moving. So it's not like that is going to completely make the game unplayable, but keep in mind that using Fog of War is going to be expensive. Yeah, there is one last thing to mention that kind of always gets forgotten. If you enable the use 3D geometry for site calculations, the scene vision will no longer work when you're in 2D. So if you're planning some kind of hybrid scene, you don't want that enabled because we can see that if we toggle 3D mode off, vision is simply going to be turned off. So it's okay now. We can see that we still have the projection from 3D, but as soon as you move and the vision refreshes, it's going to be completely black.
Good to know.
And this is because if I were to make vision work normally in 2D, then you load the scene, your player goes into 2D, everything is revealed because there is no geometry to block anything because we are in 2D, right? So that's why it gets disabled.
Yeah, great. Okay. Anything else to say on vision?
I think we covered pretty much everything. It works exactly the same as 2D. The only difference is that to make it work exactly the same as 2D, you want to enable that enable Fog of War in the 3D tab. And at that point, it's going to mirror the 2D view. If you use 3D geometry, it's going to mirror the 3D view, but use geometry instead of the walls that Foundry would normally use.
Got it. Okay. So we'll tick off enable Fog of War for now, because as part of this series, I don't know if we're going to do it in this particular episode, but we're going to show you guys an actual combat session. We're going to be the players and fight each other and throw fireballs at each other. So keep an eye out for that here in a little bit. Okay, so the last thing I think we want to go into, correct me if I'm wrong, is into general performance settings.
Yeah. So we've seen all of the things that can tank performance, especially on players with maybe integrated graphics. But we can easily turn those off for the specific players. So we don't have to make everyone else's experience miserable because, you know, there is one player that has that old MacBook from 2010. You know?
Always.
Exactly. And we can see in the 3D Canvas tab, we have a lot of settings. Every graphic settings is under this header. We can see very clearly we have these graphic settings. Anything below that is graphic settings. So the first thing we have is presets. So if you don't want to fiddle, you can just hit one of these presets. If you hover over, it's going to tell you yes. If you have like this hardware, use this. If you have that hardware, use that. And it's going to already set the settings below these buttons to the correct values to have a decent performance. But we can see that the first two checkboxes are the ones that disable the effects that we talked about before. So the shaders is going to disable those like nice fire, ice, lightning effects. the enable effects is going to disable the weather and the effects created by light or the spell effects.
Yeah.
And then we have other settings, yeah.
And this is a client-specific thing, so your players can all pick their level of
exactly.
Settings, right? Now, some other things to mention: if your players are running 4K displays, then that's going to be a problem, right? So you want to. I mean, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So it's very common these days, especially for the laptop manufacturers. I'm not sure why, but they enjoy very much making their 15-inch laptops with 4K displays and integrated graphics cards. So when you do that, 3D Canvas will automatically pick up the resolution of your screen. So if your screen is 4K, 3D Canvas is going to run in 4K. And when you try to run 4K in a browser with no dedicated graphics card or a low-end dedicated card, performance is not going to be great. So to mitigate that, there is this nice resolution multiplier slider that you can slide up and down and change the resolution of your screen. So for example, if you're running 4K, setting this at about 0.5 is going to roughly put you a 1080p. And the lowest you can do, I believe, is around 360p with 0.25. So you can really milk any hardware if you put the resolution low enough. You can have that old school Legends of Zelda feel Nintendo 64 graphics. You're going to have to hit the F5 for this to apply. But yes, we can go pretty low. And that is a great way to basically get free performance out of anything. So even the lowest of low.
I was going to say, for reference, my display is 1920 by 1080 that you're going to see here. Well,
yeah, so we're going to see a 0.25, which is going to be pretty much tragic. But, some players need to make some sacrifices for the good of the group.
Okay, so also the browser that you use matters, right? Because I've seen people trying to use Firefox, and it's a problem.
Yeah, Firefox is already a problem with basic Foundry.
Yeah.
It already creates issues, but they're less apparent because 2D performance is usually less demanding. Now we can enjoy this beautiful Nintendo 64 graphics here.
Oh, wow. It's an art house indie game now.
Yeah. And we generally suggest to use Chrome. Chrome tends to be the best browser. If you don't like Chrome, other options include basically Edge, which is also a Chromium-based browser, or I believe Brave as well is Chromium-based. So those tend to be the best choices. Chrome and Edge. If you don't want to install Chrome, you probably have Edge installed anyways in your computer because, Microsoft, and you can just use that one, just for Foundry. But I do not suggest to use Firefox at all. It's going to cause issues. So we have one last setting to touch on, which is the shared context. Without going too much into details, what this does is it kind of hijacks the 2D canvas to use as a renderer for 3D. And this means that I can basically share textures between them. This is used so I can grab the fog of war texture to render it at runtime very fast. This option, you will be prompted to enable it when you first install 3D Canvas. You can enable it and you can not enable it. That's up to you. But if you plan to use Fog of War, you should have Share Context enabled, because without Share Context, the Fog of War is going to be pretty bad and pretty low resolution. There is a catch, which is that the Share Context, let's say that hijacking rendering context is generally not a suggested workflow. So it can cause some random instabilities occasionally. For example, I don't know, you could have a crash that requires a refresh. It's not very frequent. It doesn't really happen, it doesn't really happen in my games. I've heard of people having those crashes. Usually they are a gray screen and you just hit F5, reload in, and you're fine. But keep in mind that the share context can, while it will give you better performance, it can cause these small instabilities to happen from time to time.
Yeah, now when we played our game, we had a ton of fun, by the way, but I think most of us, Zephyr, maybe didn't have the gray screen happen because we didn't know about shared context. We had it ticked on. So I think if we went back and did that game again, we'd probably tick it off and test for performance. But yeah, I mean, it's still a great time, but I think everybody had at least one gray screen come up and it was a quick refresh to fix it. But good to know that that setting exists.
Yeah, it can happen, especially in long sessions. That can happen, yeah. So keep it in mind.
Exactly. And I remember the preload shaders was causing me issues early on. I think you defaulted to off. I keep it off myself. I don't know if there's been any changes in that particular setting.
There has been a small change. Basically, in theory now, even if you enable it, it shouldn't cause like the very long load screen. It should still load in a reasonable amount of time.
Got it.
And will give you a small boost to the shader rendering if you enable them in game. The shaders, similar to the lights, can sometimes freeze the game for a couple of seconds to render the first time they render. When you enable them subsequent times, they should be snappy.
Great. Good. Good to know about these as GMs so that we know if we see gray screens come in here, if we see long load times come back in here. Okay, well, we'll end this particular episode here. And then the next one, we're going to get into actually running combat. So in part of that is we're going to show you guys how to set up animations, what comes working out of the box. We're going to talk about automation, like with MIDI qual, what works out of the box, and then where the setup is. And then we're actually going to show you guys, how to do combat. Sound good?
Yeah, sound good.
Okay, great. Well, in that case, we'll see you guys in the next episode.